thank you song to them. And I did another one of their songs, Here, There, and Everywhere. And on the album I have the single is called And Dance. And it's a fun song. It's like...
In 1991, Billy Preston drove to a Malibu pickup spot where day laborers waited for work. He picked up a young man and brought him home. According to the account, the young man soon realized he had not been brought there for a job. What followed became one of the darkest chapters in the life of a musician who had stood beside the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and Little Richard. Preston's story was filled with extraordinary success, childhood trauma, addiction, scandal, imprisonment, and tragedy. He was more than a keyboard player. He was a musical prodigy whose talent helped shape important recordings. Yet behind the applause was a man carrying wounds he rarely discussed. This is the story of Billy Preston. William Everett Preston was born in Houston, Texas in 1946. He was raised primarily by his mother, Robbie Lee Williams, and eventually moved with her to Los Angeles. Music surrounded his childhood, but Preston wasn't trained in the traditional way. He was essentially a self-taught prodigy. By the age of 10, he was already performing on stage. By 11, he was appearing on national television. One of his earliest major appearances came alongside Nat King Cole, where the young Preston performed Blueberry Hill. Only a year later, he appeared in the 1958 film St. Louis Blues, again alongside Cole. Hollywood had noticed him, but Billy's strongest connection was not with Hollywood. It was with music and faith. By 1960, his remarkable keyboard abilities had earned him a place playing with gospel performers connected to the Church of God in Christ. For Preston, gospel wasn't simply another musical genre, it was part of his identity. Music gave him a language when ordinary words weren't enough, and unfortunately, there were things happening in his childhood that he could not easily put into words. When Billy was around 9 years old, he and his mother became involved with a touring production of Amos and Andy. According to the source material, Preston later alleged that during that tour he was sexually abused by the company's pianist. The experience reportedly left a deep psychological wound. But Billy was a child performing in front of audiences while privately carrying something he didn't know how to process. For a young performer, the contrast must have been devastating. On stage, people applauded him. Off stage, he was dealing with something that should never have happened to a child. According to the account, Preston eventually told his mother what had happened, but she did not believe him. The source also states that a local pastor later became involved in his exploitation. Whether performing for thousands or sitting alone with his thoughts, Preston carried the consequences of these experiences with him. He learned to remain silent. And sometimes the things people refuse to talk about don't disappear. They follow them into adulthood. By 1962, Billy Preston was already touring with Little Richard as an organist. He was only 16. Then, during a performance in Hamburg, Germany, Preston encountered a young British band that was still on its way to becoming a worldwide phenomenon. The band was the Beatles. Years later, that chance connection would become one of the defining relationships of Preston's career. During the early 1960s, Preston continued developing his reputation. He played organ on Sam Cooke's Night Beat album and released his own debut album, 16-Year-Old Soul. His career was moving quickly. Then came the musicians who would change everything. In 1965, Preston worked with Little Richard and a young guitarist named Jimi Hendrix. But his greatest breakthrough came several years later. George Harrison invited Preston to participate in the Beatles' Get Back recording sessions. The Beatles were struggling internally. Tension filled the sessions. But when Billy Preston sat behind the keyboard, something changed. His presence brought energy into the room. He played organ and electric piano throughout the sessions. Becoming more than just another hired musician, he became part of the story. His contribution was so significant that John Lennon reportedly suggested making Preston an official Beatle. Paul McCartney rejected the idea, believing that adding another member would complicate an already complicated group. But even without the title, Billy Preston had achieved something extraordinary. He had become the musician who could walk into a room with the Beatles and belong there. On January 30th, 1969, Billy Preston joined the Beatles on the rooftop of Apple Studios. It would become one of the most famous performances in rock history. As London watched from the streets below, Preston played electric piano alongside the band. It was the Beatles' final public performance together, and Billy Preston was right there with them. After the Beatles broke apart, his relationship with the individual members continued. He released music through Apple Records, including That's the Way God Planned It. He became especially close to George Harrison. Preston had recorded My Sweet Lord before Harrison released his famous version, and the two worked together on Preston's 1970 album Encouraging Words. In 1971, Preston joined Harrison for the concert for Bangladesh at Madison Square Garden. He was no longer simply the young keyboardist who had once met the Beatles in Hamburg. He was now a star in his own right. At the height of his fame, Preston began a relationship with actress and model Kathy Silva. The couple became a familiar presence in the entertainment press. Eventually, they announced their engagement. But according to the source material, their relationship ended after Preston returned home and discovered Silva with another man, his friend, musician Sly Stone. For Billy, the betrayal reportedly had a profound effect. According to his manager Joyce Moore, Preston was never quite the same afterward. The source describes him turning away from relationships with women and becoming increasingly involved with men and illicit substances. This period is important because Preston's life was becoming increasingly divided. On one side was the public Billy Preston, the brilliant keyboardist, the Grammy-winning performer, the musician respected by the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. On the other side was a man struggling privately with trauma, identity, relationships, and addiction. And while the public continued listening to his music, his private problems were growing. The remarkable thing about Billy Preston was that even while his personal life was becoming increasingly complicated, his musical career continued reaching new heights. In 1972, he released Outta Space. The instrumental track became a massive success. It reached number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100, topped the R&B chart, sold more than 1 million copies, and earned Preston a Grammy. Then came Will It Go Round in Circles. In 1973, the song reached number 1, and in 1974, Preston did it again with Nothing from Nothing. He had transformed his gospel roots into a sound that blended soul, funk, pop, and rock. But his influence extended far beyond his own records. Preston played keyboards on multiple Rolling Stones albums, including Sticky Fingers and Exile on Main Saint. By 1973, he wasn't simply accompanying the Stones. He was opening their shows with his own band. His music was even influential enough to inspire the Stones' later work. For a musician who had grown up playing gospel, this was an extraordinary journey. But the higher Preston climbed professionally, the more difficult it became to hide what was happening privately. In 1975, Billy Preston became the first musical guest on the debut episode of Saturday Night Live. It was another milestone, another moment when millions of people could see his talent. But behind the performances, Preston was struggling. The source material describes him as wrestling with his sexuality and becoming involved in destructive relationships. By the 1980s, his career had begun to lose some of its earlier momentum. His addiction problems were becoming increasingly serious. For someone who had spent his childhood being unable to speak about trauma, fame did not necessarily make healing easier. In fact, fame could make hiding easier. He could perform, he could smile, he could walk onto a stage and become Billy Preston, the superstar. But when the lights went out, the problems remained, and eventually, they followed him into the courtroom. Then came 1991. Preston was already on probation for driving under the influence. According to authorities and the court account described in the source material, he drove to a Malibu location where day laborers gathered looking for work. There, he picked up a teenage boy. The boy was taken back to Preston's home. According to court documents cited in the source, the teenager later alleged that he and Preston smoked marijuana, that Preston showed him sexually explicit material, and that Preston attempted to assault him. The teenager escaped. The allegations became a devastating turning point in Preston's life. It is important to distinguish allegations from proven facts. The source describes what the teenager alleged and what followed in court. Preston ultimately entered a no-contest plea to the charges described in the account. He was sentenced to rehabilitation and house arrest, but the damage to his public image was enormous. The man who had once stood beside the Beatles was now appearing in headlines for something completely different. His musical legacy was being overshadowed by scandal, and his legal troubles weren't over. In 1992, Preston violated probation after another DUI incident and spent time behind bars. Then, in 1997, after repeated positive tests while on probation, he received a 3-year prison sentence. While incarcerated, Preston faced another accusation. Investigators accused him of deliberately setting fire to his Los Angeles home as part of an insurance fraud scheme involving a $1 million claim. The source states that he later pleaded guilty. More prison time followed. At this point, it would have been easy to assume that Billy Preston's story was finished. But something unexpected happened. Prison became a place where he began reconnecting with the part of himself that had always been there. Music, gospel, faith. According to the source, Preston led a choir inside prison and played during church services. Instead of allowing his musical talent to disappear, he used it to connect with other inmates. After serving part of his sentence, Preston was released, and for perhaps the first time in decades, he had an opportunity to start again. Billy Preston's comeback was meaningful. In 2002, he played piano on Johnny Cash's American 4. The Man Comes Around. He received a kidney transplant, but his health continued to deteriorate. He kept recording, contributing to Neil Diamond's 12 songs, and working with Eric Clapton. In late 2005, Preston made his public appearance, performing George Harrison songs alongside Donny Harrison and Ringo Starr. Soon afterward, he entered rehabilitation in Malibu. Heart inflammation contributed to respiratory failure, and Preston slipped into a coma in November 2005. On June 6, 2006, Billy Preston died at 59. His funeral celebrated his life. Joe Cocker sang, Little Richard preached, and messages from Paul McCartney, Eric Clapton, and the Rolling Stones were read aloud. Billy Preston's story remains complicated. He played with the Beatles and Rolling Stones, achieved solo success, but struggled with trauma, addiction, scandal, and imprisonment. In 2021, Preston was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame with the Musical Excellence Award. Through every chapter of his life, he kept returning to music. In the end, his music remained,